Thomas Jefferson sent 4 missions to explore the Louisiana Purchase. 3 of them failed. Only Lewis and Clark were successful, and just barely. The expedition party faced a series of turning points during their legendary journey, including Lewis's close call with a grizzly bear, a number of potentially deadly encounters with indigenous nations and the Spanish, and the decision to hire Sacagawea's husband as a guide, with Sacagawea herself added as an almost incidental member of the Corps of Discovery. If any of these events had gone differently, we could be living in a world where the American West, as we know it, would be a very different place.
One of my favorite things about history is that nothing is a foregone conclusion. We already have this idea that American expansion is inevitable, that all of these pieces of history are inevitable. And so one of the reasons I really like this scenario is because it forces us to look past that inevitable American expansion and to think about what could have happened. The Lewis and Clark expedition is totally something that could have gone the other way.
History isn't written in stone. It's contingent upon numerous things that have the potential to change everything. A different person, a different decision, a different question could transform history as we know it. Counterfactual scenarios are more than games or science fiction. By looking at how things might have been, we get a better look at why things are. In this episode, I ask, what if Lewis and Clark vanished? On April 29, 1805, Meriwether Lewis takes a shot at a grizzly bear and misses. The enraged bear charges and kills him and another expedition member. Without Lewis's guidance, the Corps struggles through the summer heat and men begin deserting as they struggle at Great Falls. The expedition breaks up, most of its members perish as they retreat. Lewis and Clark never return. If Lewis and Clark die in 1805, then they are not around to publish any of their findings or their maps. And there's no evidence that any American expedition has reached the spot they were aiming for, the mouth of the Columbia River in what is now Oregon. Meanwhile, the reorganized Lakota Nation would have been able to continue to consolidate its power along the upper Missouri. The rich and powerful Lakota controlled nearly all the territory between what is now Minnesota and what is now Montana, relying on numerous and skilled cavalry. The Lakota Nation had been forced across the Mississippi into the Great Plains in the early 18th century, but responded by refounding their nation in 1776 at their ancient sacred site of the Black Hills. By the time Lewis and Clark headed up the Missouri, the Lakota had consolidated their power over hundreds of square miles of territory, bringing other Indian nations into a subordinate status, and arranging trade deals with the British and Spanish. If the Lewis and Clark expedition vanished, the Lakota would continue to remain a geopolitical rival in the center of the continent, and the US would have no evidence or knowledge that there was a passage across the continent via the Missouri River. Crossing to the Pacific through the Louisiana Purchase is impossible. In this alternate world, the Oregon Trail never develops, which means the Indian nations of the Great Plains are not harried, harassed, or attacked by the 400,000 white settlers passing through on the way to Oregon, which means the Lakota solidify their economic and military control over the region. Where do those white settlers go? They go where the path exists, south, along the Santa Fe Trail, which independent Mexico opened in 1821, and the US government widened and improved in 1825. It crosses into what was then a province of an independent Mexico that invited Americans to settle there in 1827. We call it Texas. Texas still declares independence in 1835, and with an increased settler population, Texans would be able to much more easily gobble up the Mexican West and engage militarily with the existing powers in the Southwest, the Apache, the Comanche, and the Mormons. So instead of America stretching from coast to coast, the major powers west of the Mississippi would be Texas, the Lakota, and the British. and that would lead to some tense standoffs. We might even imagine 1862 peace talks in the British colony of Oregon between representatives of the powerful but unrecognized Lakota Confederacy under Sitting Bull and an aging president of Texas, Sam Houston. We could see the Texans encroaching on indigenous land to their north and west for decades. No European nation is likely to recognize the Lakota, who would nevertheless control the center of the continent and its highly profitable trade routes. Britain swoops in to preserve the peace and profits on the West Coast. At the last moment, President Houston agrees to a compromise. Texas will recognize the Lakota Confederacy in exchange for the Lakotas renouncing all claims to Mormon land. The peace treaty will go down as a durable effort of world diplomacy, remembered forever as the peace of the Little Bighorn. It's fascinating to think through the possible secondary effects of a failed Lewis and Clark expedition. But what was actually at stake? It's worth noting that in 1803, when Thomas Jefferson gets the Louisiana Purchase, he doesn't have any notion about buying Montana. He only wants the city of New Orleans at the mouth of the Mississippi. The river's a major trade route of international commerce, and whoever controls New Orleans controls that commerce. So Jefferson isn't thinking about a transcontinental empire, but he gets one. There are some misconceptions about the Louisiana Purchase. The first is in its name. The U.S. didn't actually purchase any land in the Louisiana Purchase. What Jefferson bought from France were the French claims to most of what is now the Great Plains. Spain doesn't recognize the sale. It also claims the territory. And everyone recognizes that the indigenous nations of the area have their own claims to the land and the power to back those claims up. What does Jefferson do? He sends out missions of exploration to try and map the territory and to locate a water route across the continent to the Pacific. Jefferson is absolutely sure this water route exists. Spoiler alert, he is wrong. The most remarkable thing about these missions of exploration is that they fail. Jefferson actually sends 4 missions of discovery into the Louisiana Purchase, each along a major river. Freeman and Sparks led an expedition up the Red River. They met Spanish forces from Mexico and were forced back to the U.S. Zebulon Pike took an expedition down the Arkansas River. He was actually arrested and imprisoned by the Spanish. Hunter and Dunbar headed up the Ouachita River. Hunter accidentally shot himself, and then the expedition hit bad weather and turned back. That left Lewis and Clark.
So Meriwether Lewis, by the time we get to the early 1800s, is the secretary to the president. And William Clark had served in a number of militias. He fought in the Northwest Indian War. And Lewis actually recruits Clark to the Corps of Discovery because they had a prior relationship, given the fact that Clark was actually one of Lewis's commanders during the time they spent in the war.
So Lewis and Clark are the exception, not the rule. Most of the expeditions failed. If Lewis and Clark had vanished, 4 of 4 expeditions would have failed. When Lewis and Clark head out to meet indigenous nations, they need to make contact with them to establish diplomatic relations so that the land can be bought from the nations in the future. Lewis and Clark are trying to get the U.S. in with native nations and to keep the British and Spanish out. The struggle for the center of the continent is thousands of years old. If you think this is flyover country, it's time to reconsider what's really at stake. For at least 200 years, European empires have joined in the clash of indigenous nations to control the land and its resources. Alexander Mackenzie of Britain made a transcontinental journey across Canada in 1791. On the northwest coast, the Salish, Chinook, Tlingit, and other nations established trade relations in the 1790s with Russia and Britain. The Salish and other indigenous nations trade in furs and salmon, using British ships, with Hawaii and China. Lewis and Clark aren't out there just to see if they can do it. They are out there to find routes and begin the process of entering the United States into this contest for the center of the continent.
The United States government whether they wanted to or not, implicitly recognized the sovereignty of indigenous nations every time they signed a treaty. And this starts to get tricky, and it will remain tricky, spoiler alert, but it gets tricky when we start seeing what Jefferson wants to do with the Corps of Discovery and with this expedition, and how in this moment, right, he's really trying to finagle around not only potential Spanish claims and French claims and British claims and even Russian claims, but he also has to try to find a way to maneuver around all of these indigenous claims to sovereignty. And so the reason this is important and the reason why it matters that, in this charge that Jefferson lays out to Lewis and Clark, we have all of these records, all of these letters, these messages to Congress, his annual messages, things like that, where Jefferson is very clearly talking about the best ways, the easiest ways to get Native nations to cede their lands. There's a letter that he wrote to William Henry Harrison where he is very clear about this. There's a note he has about what it would be like, in essence, to set up trading houses among these Native nations, not for the purposes of providing goods and trade and things like that, but in order to put indigenous nations into debt. And by putting indigenous nations into debt, right, by forcing them into debt, he very clearly states that once these nations have run up these massive bills, they're going to start to sell off their lands because it's the only way that they can pay these bills. And so when we're looking at the Corps of Discovery, when we're looking at this moment of, amazing American exploration and, ingenuity and things like that, we also have to understand that this is what's at the core.
Modern American borders are a political settlement of the 19th century. Change the military and political situation in 1803, and the borders shift too. Because Lewis and Clark almost didn't make it. We know from their journals that Lewis really did run into two grizzlies on April 29th, 1805. He shot at the animals, one bear escaped, the other charged. Lewis reported being chased by the bear, but fortunately the creature had been sufficiently wounded so as to give Lewis time to reload while running, and the second shot killed the bear. It was still pretty close. There were other extremely close calls on their mission. They almost die of starvation in Montana. The Nez Perce Nation votes whether or not to kill them once they stumble into their territory. It's a close vote. The Spanish in Mexico also send out a military expedition after Lewis and Clark. The Spanish were tipped off by James Wilkinson, who was head of the U.S. Army and also a paid spy in the service of Spain. Remember, Spain turns back two other American expeditions. In fact, the one thing Lewis and Clark had that the other expeditions lacked was Sacagawea. And they did not originally make her a member of the Corps.
Sacagawea was a Shoshone woman. She was kidnapped by Hidatsa when she was a child, kind of preteen age, I think is kind of the best estimate. And then shortly thereafter, she is sold into marriage to a French trapper, trader, kind of something along those lines. And then a couple years later, when Lewis and Clark kind of start making their way west, they build what's called Fort Mandan, where they kind of stop for the winter, regroup, make sure that they have enough provisions to get through. And so they're hiring interpreters. They're trying to find people that can help them along the way. And so one of the men they hire is Sacagawea's husband. And I would venture a guess that one of the reasons they hire him is not only because of his skills, but because of the skills of Sacagawea. One of the most crucial events on the journey happens in May of 1805 when, they're traveling by canoe. They've got all of these records, their journals, right? Like this very documentation that they have been sent to capture and collect. They've got all of these things in these boats, and one of the boats collapses. And Sacagawea is the person who manages to save just about everything that had fallen overboard. And the story is important for a couple of reasons. The main reason, I would argue, is that without her efforts, once again, right? So not only does she take them all the way to the Pacific Ocean, having navigated and interpreted and done all of these different things along the way, she's also saving the tangible records of it.
Sacagawea saved the expedition a second time, when she successfully guided them through Shoshone territory and is able to prove to her brother, now the leader of the Shoshone Nation, that it's an expedition of peace. Some people think it was mountain men who won the West for the United States, but Lewis and Clark only succeeded because of a pregnant teenage Native American woman they never intended to include. And it was Sacagawea who saved what made the most difference in history: the journals and the maps. The journals of Lewis and Clark provide the basic route for an overland effort to establish a colony in Oregon by John Jacob Astor in 1811. This effort fails spectacularly, but they use Lewis and Clark's journals and maps as a guide. Astor's failed expedition then provides the basic route for the Oregon Trail of 1836 and its flood of 400,000 odd white settlers. So, no Lewis and Clark in 1805, no Astor expedition in 1811, no Astor expedition in 1811, no Oregon Trail in 1836. And that matters. Remember, when white colonists head into what is now the U.S. West, they don't just randomly head somewhere and build a cabin. They follow established routes. Lewis and Clark wrote the blueprint, and it traveled northwest. Indeed, Clark himself launched a fur company in 1809 to exploit the land he had just chronicled. Another member, Charles Floyd, convinced his family to push for Oregon colonization in the 1820s. That resulted in an organized society in the 1830s, promoting missionaries to travel to the Oregon country. It all went back to men of the Lewis and Clark expedition. Again, with no established northwest route in the 1820s, we can also imagine there's a delayed confrontation between the Americans and the Lakota Nation. Jefferson in 1803 specifically wrote to Lewis about the Lakota. On that nation, we wish most particularly to make a friendly impression because of their immense power. He later wrote, "In their quarter, we are miserably weak." Jefferson was right. When Lewis and Clark met the Lakota, they fled when the leader Black Buffalo commandeered their boat for a day. Even with the successful return of Lewis and Clark, the Lakota still controlled the upper Missouri River through the 1830s. As one historian writes, the Lakota got the better of American interlopers and they contained the United States expansion westward. Indeed, part of what weakened Lakota power in the 1840s was the rise of white settlers along the improved Oregon Trail, built for wagons. The cattle that white Americans brought with them competed for grass and forage with the enormous bison herds of the Great Plains. If the trail does not get improved because it does not get made, the basis for Lakota power remains through the 1860s. It might not have been a world power, but it would have been a militarily powerful trade and cultural alliance seeking recognition of its sovereignty. Without an Oregon Trail, American land fever is reduced to one stream, into the Southwest, instead of two streams. Texas gets even more white settlers and still declares independence from Mexico. A Texas twice as big as it already was asks to join the United States. As in real life, Andrew Jackson says no. Texas dusts itself off and begins its expansion into the Rocky Mountains. Texas was not destined for absorption into the U.S. A group of Texas politicians, including Mirabeau Lamar, its second president, sought permanent independence and expansion. They wanted a great Texan empire. To prove it, Lamar invaded Mexico, tried to annex Santa Fe, and fought bloody wars against the Comanche and Cherokee nations. In our world, Lamar's efforts didn't go very far. But if the white settlers who headed northwest instead headed to Texas, Lamar's ability to expand would have been vastly increased. Texas could easily have gone as far as California. In fact, the Texas Congress claimed California for Texas in the 1840s. Meanwhile, U.S. claims on the northwest coast would have been non-existent. In European law, the doctrine of discovery requires finding the mouth of a river. U.S. claims in real life go back to Lewis and Clark and the Historia expedition. Britain has real-life competing claims from naval voyages by James Cook and George Vancouver. Without Lewis and Clark, then the U.S. doesn't even have paper justification. Britain's claims to the northwest coast go unchallenged. So by 1845, we would see a very different North American West that looks something like this. Texas is gobbling up lands in the southwest. Britain claims the Oregon Territory, which it runs as a trade depot, relying on the tacit acquiescence of Indian nations. While the Lakota maintain a wary trade network and continue to play the Americans off against the Texans and the British. Fast forward to 1862. Sam Houston is back in the Texas presidency, and his republic has forced Mexico to abandon its claims to the Californias. Texas is also aggressively expanding into Indian territory, but Houston wants some kind of conciliation. White American settlers are encroaching on Lakota territory, and the Lakota make common cause with Britain, who does not want Americans trespassing on its profitable Oregon territory. I'd like to think the Lakota would turn to one of their most effective leaders of the 1860s, Red Cloud, or maybe a very young Sitting Bull. And these leaders might very well sit down for negotiations somewhere between all three of their territories, perhaps the Little Bighorn, to craft a peace in 1876. We often assume that American expansion was inevitable. The idea is baked into American history, and it's definitely true that American businesses and settlers always seemed to be looking for more land. We call this idea manifest destiny, but that term was invented by John O'Sullivan in 1845, after the United States seized the Pacific coast. Americans got there, then said it was destiny. In many ways, manifest destiny is a result of the Lewis and Clark expedition, not its cause. The success of the expedition sent follow-up efforts across the continent along the same route, and members of the expedition themselves promoted those efforts. If they hadn't made it, geopolitics in North America did not favor a northwest route. It favored a southwest route. Texas really does break away from Mexico and try its hand at western expansion in the 1830s. The Lakota really do rule the Great Plains and keep the Americans at bay through the 1830s. And their real problem was white American settlers breaking up the bison herds. Even if we assume that there is no Lewis and Clark, no Astor expedition, and a delay of only 10 to 15 years before American policymakers begin to think about the Oregon Country, well, by then, the Western powers are Texas, the Lakota, and the British.
I think the biggest potential outcome, if Lewis and Clark are eaten by bears, is that you have these indigenous nations in the American West who are able to maintain their lands. They're able to maintain their customs, their languages. And I know that's not, kind of the fun, like, what if, right? As much fun as it is to think about Lewis and Clark getting eaten by bears. But again, as a Native scholar who does Native history, right, this is an era that is always really hard to teach. It's hard to talk about because it is so easy to see that trail. It's so easy to be able to trace all of these pieces back, right? And in some sense, we can trace them back to the core of discovery in Lewis and Clark. As far as the what if scenario that goes along with this, it's always really fun to think about something like this, to think about this indigenous confederacy, this indigenous coalition that is in a really incredible position of power. And I'm honing in on one very tiny detail here because I'm a historian and I can't help it. I think it's why we are who we are. But I love that in this what if, the place that they're asked to kind of give up or cede, relinquish their claims to is not the Black Hills. And I'm going to guess that was done on purpose. Because to think about this place that they're asked to cede versus the place that's their homeland is really poignant, because to have the power to cede something that might not be of much value to you, might not be worth much in the grand scheme of things, really shows strength and power. And thinking about, the peace of the Little Bighorn as opposed to the Battle of the Little Bighorn is really kind of cool.
Did Americans' conquest of the West come from geography, or from a lucky shot by Meriwether Lewis, ensuring he did not get eaten by the grizzly in 1805? We call the West as we know it manifest destiny to make it seem like what happened was easy and inevitable. But politics and chance could make a very different West just as manifest.